Donald Trump demands to recognize Crimea as Russian. Kit Kellogg says that NATO's doors are closed for Ukraine, and Russia has ended its fake ceasefire with Shaheds and missiles flying over Ukrainian territory. Welcome, friends, to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko, and today, April 21st, Monday, on this day, for you the latest information, a briefing on those events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. So, what is happening? What is happening is that the so-called Easter truce has ended. Putin didn't last long. In fact, we see that air raid alerts have been recorded, missile strikes, and drones over the territory of Ukraine. It's not as large scale as it was before, but still nevertheless. Thus, it can be stated that the Russian dictator rejected the proposal of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, that if we managed, even for a day, to record the absence of missile and drone strikes, then this state should be maintained. Accordingly, it would be necessary to specifically record the cessation of long-range drone and missile strikes on civilian cities and infrastructure. As it appears, Russia ignored this in fact and launched a drone. At the same time, the President of the USA, Donald Trump, made a statement. This was probably still at Mar-a-Lago when he wrote on Truth Social in his social network, expressing his wish that he believes that this week, already this week, Russia and Ukraine could reach an agreement. He did not specify whether it was a peace agreement or a ceasefire. But, as is known, this week there will be active consultations in London between European partners and Ukraine, and the United States of America, where the issues of a ceasefire and further peace victories will be decided. The Wall Street Journal has revealed, let's say, well, not exactly a secret. Let's be honest, we weren't unaware of this, we had heard about it before. So the Wall Street Journal has opened up the door to what is happening and noted that Trump expects Ukraine to recognize Crimea as Russian, and in addition to refuse to join NATO. The authors of the Wall Street Journal article note that the US conditions include these points, and they do not include the demilitarization of Ukraine. That is, they are saying that Ukraine can have a sizable army. Moreover, they are not opposed to Europe playing a significant role in the future support of Ukraine in ensuring security, and they allow for the deployment of foreign contingents under the command of France and Britain on Ukrainian territory. This is what the Wall Street Journal writes about. This is what they are talking about. To this we can add what Bloomberg wrote about. The American agency noted on the eve of the weekend, that is, on Friday, April 18th, and then on Saturday, April 19th, that the US is considering a scenario, freezing the conflict along the line of engagement, while considering a scenario of partial or complete lifting of sanctions. With the prospect of completely lifting sanction restrictions from Russia, these are the possible demands we have today. And so it can already be said that if at this stage, even before a ceasefire, it can be stated that there is already talk of possible concessions. That is, we see this being written about by American media quite actively. At the same time, if we look at the reaction of the media and our Western partners to what can be called a fake Easter truce initiated by Putin, which he conducted as an informational and psychological action to demonstrate to the USA and Donald Trump that Americans should, though not withdraw from negotiations, that Putin is interested in the USA remaining involved. Well, of course, why wouldn't Putin be interested in the USA? The question here is, if the Americans will pressure Ukraine, and it seems that the USA's position will not change for now, at least as of now, and the pressure will mainly be directed at Ukraine, This must be acknowledged. And we are observing this right now. I think that this week during the negotiations in London, we will also see many such moments. If the USA is pressuring Ukraine, then why would Russia want Trump to withdraw from the negotiations? They will be interested. The Russian dictator Putin will only be clapping his hands. That's all he needs. But for the USA to remain, it's necessary to create an informational background and foundation so that Trump doesn't appear weak, which he seems to be in many ways after all. To ensure he doesn't appear weak, he needed to be supported. And in fact, this is a kind of multi-step strategy, if you will. It's often said that Putin plays along with Trump, as has happened repeatedly. You know, on my channel, I've mentioned more than once that how Russia operates, how its methods of psychological influence work, how they identify weak points and areas in Trump's policies in his public speeches and statements. And they try to catch him on this and play along, sensing a certain nerve. They constantly touch this nerve, including through their own informational propaganda and messaging. And accordingly, this ceasefire, which the media recognized as truly fake, look, The Guardian wrote that Russia itself proposed it and then violated it. France 24 quotes the president of Ukraine, saying that while the Kremlin talks about a truce, our intelligence records strikes, artillery, and drones at the front. Bloomberg, Putin violated his own truce. CNN, both sides accuse each other. There is no peace. BBC, about what is being recorded, and once again provides a quote from Volodymyr Zelensky saying Putin's words are empty. Ukrainians were dying on Easter. And records facts of ceasefire violations. Reuters. The same, meaning a multitude of informational reports that note and provide quotes specifically from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. That is, from the perspective of informational warfare and influence, Ukraine, informationally, won this round. We won because Western media, in the informational space, Western media, they clearly indicate and demonstrate that Ukraine is right, that Putin is violating his own ceasefire. What else can be discussed? But have we won in the media, informationally, psychologically, in the eyes of US President Donald Trump? This is the key question. And here, there are doubts. But why? Not because Ukraine isn't working. Ukraine is working. President Zelensky of Ukraine is personally making extraordinary efforts, working towards that, thank you. To truly advance the Ukrainian informational agenda, diplomats are working and so on. But, the question is whether you want to perceive it, and whether you want to hear rational arguments and explanations that will influence your point of view, and in further accordingly to form an order, the agenda. And if US President Trump does not want to hear the corresponding point of view, or he hears it but dismisses it, as Trump has already formed his own vision, and he understands that he is, at certain moments and in certain ways, weak in front of Putin, well, let's acknowledge that the great again only applies when it comes to Russia. Great again is nowhere to be seen. This also needs to be acknowledged. It's also noticeable because the criticism of everyone, the pressure on everyone around the world against many countries except Russia, and the critical remarks absolutely justified towards Putin, they are simply absent. And therefore, actually, it creates the impression that this vision, Trump's vision, is already formed. He is as he is. And he plans to put more pressure on Ukraine. And Ukraine is fighting, including in the information field. We need this fight. Maximum in terms of supporting Ukraine. Because, well, we see what direction is being taken. Let's look at this also in terms of analysis. Does Ukraine help change the position? Well, yes. If initially it was about 5 regions, yes, including Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, which the Russian army does not even occupy. This is nonsense in international politics and in history. It's clear, no one will agree to this, but now it's being removed. Currently, only Crimea remains on the agenda. So, even from the perspective of making efforts, yes, this is not a victory for us, but a success in many ways, as not all regions are involved. Could this have happened due to the active policy and position of the Ukrainian authorities? Yes. Did Ukraine make efforts towards this? Yes. Will Russia agree to these terms? There are doubts as of today. Possibly, as for a ceasefire, only for a ceasefire. For them, this will already be acceptable, and they will be able to declare victory for themselves. Since it is important to understand that certain conditions have been met and a precedent has been set. And for Putin, the precedent is important, which will create the appropriate prerequisites for the future to then impose the corresponding conditions, move forward and talk about, oh, well, you already did this, so now let's talk about the Donetsk region, about the Luhansk region. Then we will move on to the south. Well, since they agreed with Crimea, refused NATO, and so on. That is, here, as they say, excuse me for the language, the aggressor's appetite grows while eating. And in this, there are all the risks and dangers that also need to be assessed and understood. Therefore, I think the struggle in London will be very intense. There will be clashes, there will be statements, but can this change Donald Trump's point of view? We'll see. I still have doubts. And in general, Trump might use this argument and say that, well, look, Ukraine does not agree, we offered. So we are withdrawing from the negotiations and blame official Kyiv for this. I wouldn't be surprised if the reaction is accordingly. That is, unfortunately, we need to understand that this might happen, can change position. What happened in the USA this weekend? April 1920, where? There were mass protests, they were in New York, in San Francisco, in other cities, and they were against the authoritarian style of governance, Trump's management of the state. Calls are increasingly being heard. Impeachment of Trump is increasingly coming into the public sphere, is being discussed, it's visible, it's audible. It can be said that these protest actions were not as large scale as those 2 weeks ago, but they were in different states, in different cities. And it's important to note that such protest actions and movements have a systemic nature. That is, they will evidently continue. Well, and this will undoubtedly have an impact. Because today, American politicians are also diverse, and different ones visit Ukraine, and there are different opinions. There are American Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a representative of the Republican Party of the USA, visited the front and signed a shell for Putin. It was a great honor for me to deliver a very personal message to Putin today from the front line near the Russian border. The only details allowed to be shared are that the message was delivered to its target, Fitzpatrick said. Fitzpatrick supports Ukraine. There are also such congressmen and senators. But will they be heard? Will their opinions prevail now? That's what's most important. They must, of course, speak out very loudly about it. Because, for example, a Pew Research Group survey showed that the share of Americans who consider Russia an enemy has fallen to 50% compared to 61% in April 2024 and 70% in March 2022. Overall, 38% of Americans now call Russia a competitor of the USA. Furthermore, fewer Americans now say that the USA is responsible for helping Ukraine defend against aggression. 44%, compared to 50% after the presidential elections in November, which is a 6% drop over 3 months. And of course, from the perspective of, well, let's say, assessing the situation and its impact on American politics. Is Trump guided by this sociology? Yes, the Republicans. And in general, the president's administration in the USA operates within the framework of so-called polls. That is, those who conduct a lot of these various polls, aimed at determining public opinion among the American audience on many points and a multitude of issues. So, in fact, we see here that such surveys undoubtedly also set a certain agenda. Well, and Kit Kellogg, the special representative of Donald Trump for Ukraine, appeared on the American TV channel Fox News and noted that the doors for Ukraine to NATO are closed. And he said this quote, "We have stated it extremely clearly. NATO is off the table. You will not become part of NATO. This idea is not new. We have been talking about it since 2008. So in fact, the situation is here." He started to mention historical excursions and so on. In addition, he confirmed that Trump and Rubio are somewhat tired from the lack of progress and they might leave the negotiation process. Such is the situation. These are the realities we face. There is actually a certain conspiracy. You know that I often talk about this and make videos on the channel. I see that there are sometimes critical remarks. Of course, it's not something one wants to admit, and that there is some kind of compromising material. It might be with Putin, with Trump, and so on. But let's open our eyes and look at this situation. Well, that is to say, actually speaking, what else can be said here? Obviously, there is data suggesting there might be a conspiracy. And there is the theory about Agent Krasnov. You know, it doesn't disappear anywhere. Meanwhile, Europe continues to support Ukraine. And the head of Rheinmetall, Papager, noted that they plan to increase the production of shells. And Ukraine will have the necessary supplies, and overall, the concern will produce exclusively for Ukraine 750,000 shells per year and can increase to 1.5 million. This is very good news, and I hope that European partners will continue to support us systematically. Friends, please subscribe to my channel. Write comments about what you think regarding the possible Trump-Putin conspiracy and the situation in general. And will they reach an agreement in London this week? And at what possible cost? How do you see this situation developing further? And take care of yourselves. And glory to Ukraine.